Hey, welcome back. Let everything quiet down and we'll ease into a slow tale from ancient Rome. Becoming a Roman soldier did not begin with glory. It began with a choice, sometimes freely made, sometimes forced by circumstance. For most men, enlistment was not driven by dreams of conquest or heroic death, but by practical realities: hunger, debt, lack of land, or the simple need for stability in a world where survival was never guaranteed. To step into the Roman army was to step into a new identity, one that replaced family ties, personal freedom, and civilian life with discipline, obedience, and the constant presence of authority. For a young man standing at the threshold of enlistment, Rome was not an idea or a distant capital. It was a system that reached into villages, farms, and city streets, offering wages, food, and legal protection in exchange for total commitment. Once the oath was sworn, the soldier's life no longer belonged to himself. It belonged to the army, to the unit, and ultimately to the state. The path into military service varied depending on time period, location, and status, but the underlying experience remained consistent across centuries. Joining the Roman army meant entering one of the most controlled environments in the ancient world, where nearly every aspect of daily life was regulated, observed, and enforced. Recruitment was both selective and pragmatic. Roman authorities needed large numbers of men, but they also demanded physical capability, mental resilience, and the ability to endure years of hardship. While standards shifted over time, recruits were generally expected to be young, healthy, and free of visible disabilities. Height mattered, strength mattered, and stamina mattered more than all else. A man who could march long distances under heavy load was far more valuable than one who merely looked impressive. Citizenship played a central role in determining where a recruit would serve. Roman citizens typically entered the legions, the core heavy infantry of the army. Non-citizens, including provincials and foreigners, were usually assigned to auxiliary units. These units performed essential roles: cavalry, archers, scouts, and light infantry, and often faced greater risk with fewer privileges. For many non-citizens, however, service offered a powerful incentive: the promise of Roman citizenship after years of loyal duty. The decision to enlist was rarely romantic. Many recruits were second or third sons with no inheritance. Others were men escaping legal trouble, social stagnation, or economic collapse. Rural areas, especially those affected by war or taxation, provided a steady stream of volunteers. In cities, recruiters targeted the unemployed and underemployed, offering regular pay and meals in exchange for service. For men with little to lose, the army represented structure and opportunity. The enlistment process itself was formal and intimidating. Recruits were examined, questioned, and recorded. Names, places of origin, and physical characteristics were noted. Once accepted, the recruit swore the military oath, binding himself to obey orders, remain loyal to the emperor or state, and never desert. This oath was not symbolic. Breaking it carried severe punishment, often death. That moment marked a permanent break from civilian life. From that point forward, the recruit was subject to military law, not civilian courts. His movements, clothing, speech, and even personal relationships were regulated. Marriage was often restricted or forbidden during service, reinforcing the idea that a soldier's primary loyalty was to his unit, not a household. The first day in the army was often overwhelming. New recruits were immediately stripped of individuality. Hair was cut short. Civilian clothing was replaced with standardized gear. Personal items were limited, inspected, and often discarded. From the beginning, the army imposed uniformity, reinforcing that no man stood apart from the group. Recruits were assigned to units and introduced to their superiors. Centurions, the backbone of discipline, made a lasting impression. These men were not distant officers. They were ever-present enforcers of order. Their authority was absolute within the unit, and their reputation often inspired fear as much as respect. A centurion's voice, posture, and bearing communicated a simple truth: obedience was not optional. Language itself became a tool of control. Commands were short, sharp, and standardized. Recruits learned to respond instantly, without hesitation. Delayed reaction was treated as disobedience. Confusion was not an excuse. From the beginning, soldiers were trained to act collectively, suppressing individual instinct in favor of coordinated movement. The emotional impact of enlistment was profound. Many recruits had never traveled far from home. Suddenly, they found themselves surrounded by strangers from distant regions, speaking unfamiliar dialects and carrying different customs. The army brought together men from across the empire, forcing them into close quarters and shared routines. Bonds formed quickly, not out of affection but necessity. Homesickness was common but rarely acknowledged. The culture of the army discouraged displays of vulnerability. Complaints were seen as weakness. Endurance, silence, and compliance were valued traits. Recruits learned quickly that survival depended on adapting, not resisting. Training began almost immediately. There was no gradual adjustment period. The army assumed that if a man had volunteered, he was ready to suffer. Physical conditioning was relentless. Marching, lifting, running, and drilling consumed the day. Mistakes were corrected through repetition, shouting, and punishment. Praise was rare. Improvement was expected. Recruits learned that the army valued function over comfort. Blisters were ignored. Muscle pain was considered routine. Fatigue was not a reason to stop. The goal was not merely to make men strong, but to make them reliable under stress. A soldier who could perform while exhausted was far more valuable than one who excelled only when rested. Beyond physical hardship, recruits were introduced to the concept of collective responsibility. Punishment was often applied to groups rather than individuals. One man's failure could bring consequences to an entire unit. This system discouraged individual error and encouraged peer enforcement. Soldiers watched each other closely, correcting mistakes before officers intervened. The first weeks reshaped a man's identity. Civilian habits faded quickly. Personal schedules disappeared. Meals, sleep, work, and rest all followed the Army's timetable. Even silence was regulated. Over time, recruits stopped thinking in terms of personal preference and began thinking in terms of orders and expectations. By the end of initial induction, a recruit understood a fundamental truth. Life as a Roman soldier was not defined by battle but by routine. Glory was rare. Survival depended on discipline, obedience, and endurance. The army did not promise heroism. It promised structure, hardship, and a place within the machinery of empire. This was only the beginning. The oath had been sworn, the body conditioned, and the mind reshaped. From this point forward, the soldier would measure time not in years or seasons, but in marches, watches, and orders carried out without question. The transformation from civilian to soldier was irreversible. Even those who survived their service and returned home would never fully shed the habits learned during these first days. The army left its mark early, and it stayed for life. The Roman army did not believe that men were naturally fit for war. Strength, endurance, and coordination were not assumed. They were manufactured through repetition, fatigue, and constant pressure. Training was not a phase to be completed and left behind. It was a permanent condition of military life, shaping the soldier's body and mind day after day, year after year. From the moment a recruit was accepted, his body became an object to be reshaped. The army's expectations were clear and uncompromising. A soldier had to march farther, carry more, and endure longer than any civilian. Comfort was treated as a liability. Ease was something to be eliminated, not preserved. Training began with marching, the foundation of all Roman military movement. Recruits learned quickly that marching was not simply walking in formation. It was a controlled, rhythmic act performed under load, often for hours at a time. Soldiers were expected to maintain pace, alignment, and silence while carrying equipment that could exceed 50 pounds. Shields, weapons, armor, tools, rations, and personal gear all rested on the body at once, pressing down on shoulders, hips, and feet. Distance mattered more than speed. The Army prioritized endurance over bursts of effort. Recruits were trained to move steadily across long stretches of road, dirt, and uneven terrain without falling out of formation. Falling behind was not treated as a personal issue. It was a failure that affected the entire unit. The group slowed, discipline tightened, and punishment often followed. Footwear became a constant concern. Military sandals were durable but unforgiving. Long marches produced blisters, cracked skin, and swollen feet. There was little sympathy for these injuries. Recruits were expected to adapt quickly, learning how to harden their feet, adjust their gait, and endure pain without complaint. Over time, feet toughened, scars formed, and sensitivity faded. Weapons training followed a similar philosophy. Recruits did not begin with the weapons they would carry into battle. Instead, they trained with heavier wooden swords and shields. These practice tools increased strain and fatigue, making real equipment feel lighter by comparison. Hours were spent striking posts, repeating the same controlled motions until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. Precision mattered more than aggression. Soldiers were trained to thrust rather than slash, conserving energy and maintaining formation. Each movement was deliberate, drilled repeatedly until it became automatic. The goal was not to win individual duels, but to function as a part of a larger body. Formation training reinforced this idea. Recruits learned to move, turn, halt, and advance as a single unit. Commands were issued loudly and expected to be executed instantly. Hesitation disrupted alignment and invited punishment. Over time, soldiers learned to read subtle cues from those around them, adjusting without conscious instruction. Running and jumping were integrated into daily routines, not as sport, but as preparation for chaos. Soldiers trained to move quickly while burdened, to leap obstacles, climb embankments, and recover balance under strain. Wrestling and sparring built strength and resilience, teaching recruits how to remain functional while exhausted or off balance. Swimming was also emphasized, particularly for units stationed near rivers or coasts. Soldiers practiced crossing water while holding weapons and equipment above the surface. Drowning was a real risk, and fear of water was treated as a weakness to be eliminated through exposure. The physical demands of training were matched by its psychological pressure. Repetition was relentless. Drills were performed daily, regardless of weather. Rain, heat, cold, and wind were treated as training conditions, not obstacles. Soldiers learned to function while soaked, overheated, or shivering because battle offered no shelter. Rest was controlled and limited. Sleep schedules followed strict routines, often interrupted by night watches or sudden alarms. These disruptions were intentional. The Army conditioned soldiers to remain effective despite fatigue, understanding that exhaustion was inevitable during campaigns. Mistakes were corrected immediately. A missed step, a late response, or a sloppy movement rarely passed unnoticed. Correction often came in the form of additional drills or physical punishment. The objective was not cruelty, but conditioning. The Army believed that pressure revealed weakness, and weakness had to be eliminated before it could cost lives. Over time, the body adapted, muscles strengthened, lungs expanded, posture changed. Soldiers developed a distinctive way of moving, shaped by load-bearing and constant exertion. Endurance replaced speed. Efficiency replaced force. Movements became economical, conserving energy for long days rather than short bursts. Just as important as physical adaptation was mental transformation. Training taught soldiers to accept discomfort as normal. Pain lost its urgency. Fatigue became background noise. Complaints faded because they served no purpose. What remained was focus, routine, and the ability to function under strain. Training also reinforced hierarchy. Recruits learned quickly who issued orders and who enforced them. Instructions were not debated. Understanding was less important than compliance. This mindset carried into every aspect of military life, ensuring cohesion even under extreme stress. The constant repetition built trust, not in individuals, but in systems. Soldiers trusted that the man beside them had endured the same drills. carried the same load, and learned the same movements. This shared experience created a bond stronger than personal friendship. It created reliability. By the end of initial conditioning, recruits were no longer civilians struggling through exercises. They were soldiers whose bodies responded automatically to command and routine. Marching, drilling, lifting, and striking were no longer conscious efforts. They were habits embedded into muscle and mind. This transformation was never complete. Even veteran soldiers continued to train. The Army did not allow skills to fade. Conditioning was maintained throughout service, ensuring that readiness never depended on memory or motivation. Training was simply life. Through this relentless process, the Roman army produced soldiers capable of enduring conditions that would break untrained men. The body became a tool, shaped by discipline and repetition, ready to carry the empire's weight wherever it was sent. A Roman soldier was never separated from his equipment. From the moment he rose in the morning until he lay down at night, his body bore the weight of the tools that defined his role. Gear was not an accessory to military life. It was the center of it. Every strap, buckle, and edge served a purpose, and failure to maintain any part of it could mean injury, punishment, or death. The most visible element of a soldier's identity was his armor. Depending on period and assignment, this might include segmented metal plates, chainmail, or scale armor. Whatever the form, armor was designed for durability rather than comfort. It rubbed against the skin, trapped heat, and restricted movement. Soldiers learned to accept this as normal. Complaints about armor were meaningless. Protection mattered more than ease. Helmets were equally essential and equally unforgiving. Metal pressed down on the skull for hours at a time, absorbing sweat and heat. Vision and hearing were partially restricted, forcing soldiers to rely on training rather than instinct. Helmets were cleaned, repaired, and inspected constantly. A cracked rim or loose fitting could turn a glancing blow into a fatal one. The shield was the soldier's constant companion. Large, curved, and heavy, it was designed to protect not only the man carrying it, but the soldier standing beside him. Shields were not decorative. They bore dents, cuts, and scratches that told stories of past engagements. Maintaining a shield meant more than patching wood or leather. It meant preserving the integrity of the formation. Weapons were simple, standardized, and brutally effective. The short sword was built for close combat, favoring thrusts over wide swings. Spears or javelins extended reach and disrupted enemy lines before contact. Each weapon had a specific role, and soldiers were trained to use them in sequence rather than preference. Personal flair was discouraged. Consistency saved lives. Clothing beneath the armor was practical and layered. Tunics absorbed sweat and reduced friction. Cloaks offered warmth and protection from rain, doubling as blankets at night. These garments wore out quickly under constant use and had to be repaired regularly. Soldiers learned basic sewing not out of hobby but necessity. Footwear endured constant punishment. Military sandals were built with thick soles reinforced by metal studs, designed to survive long marches over rough terrain. They provided traction and durability but little cushioning. Soldiers replaced straps, patched soles, and adjusted fit continually. Neglecting footwear was one of the fastest ways to become unfit for duty. Beyond weapons and armor, soldiers carried tools. Every man was expected to contribute to building and maintenance work. Shovels, picks, axes, and saws were standard issue on campaign. These tools allowed soldiers to construct camps, dig ditches, build roads, and erect fortifications. The army moved with its infrastructure, and soldiers were its labor force. Personal gear filled what space remained. Cooking pots, rations, water containers, spare clothing, and small personal items were packed carefully to balance weight. Soldiers learned how to distribute their load to reduce strain and prevent injury. Poor packing was quickly corrected, often harshly. The combined weight of this equipment was immense. Marching under full load reshaped the body. Shoulders thickened, backs strengthened, and posture adapted to constant pressure. Over time, soldiers developed a distinctive stance, leaning slightly forward to counterbalance the weight they carried. Maintenance was a daily obligation. Weapons were cleaned, oiled, and sharpened. Armor was inspected for damage. Straps were tightened, rivets checked, and leather treated. Neglect was interpreted as laziness or defiance. A soldier whose gear failed inspection could expect punishment regardless of circumstances. Uniformity mattered. Equipment was standardized to ensure compatibility and discipline. Soldiers were expected to look alike, move alike, and fight alike. Excess decoration or personalization was discouraged or forbidden. The Army valued function over expression. Yet small personal touches still appeared. Scratches carved into shields, subtle modifications to grips, or carefully chosen charms tucked away out of sight offered soldiers a sense of individuality. These details were private, rarely acknowledged openly. The relationship between soldier and equipment was intimate. Gear absorbed sweat, blood, and dirt. It aged alongside its owner. A well-maintained kit reflected experience and competence. A neglected one marked a man as unreliable. In battle, equipment became an extension of the body. There was no time to think about straps or balance. Everything had to function automatically. Training ensured that movements accounted for weight and restriction without conscious effort. Outside of combat, equipment defined daily routine. Carrying, storing, repairing, and inspecting gear consumed hours of each day. Even rest periods were shaped by the presence of armor and weapons nearby. A soldier was never truly unarmed. The Army understood that control over equipment was control over soldiers. Issuing, inspecting, and replacing gear reinforced hierarchy and dependence. Nothing belonged fully to the individual. Everything could be taken, reassigned, or replaced by order. Through years of service, a soldier's body and equipment became inseparable. The weight, the smell, and the wear became familiar. What once felt unbearable became ordinary. In this way, gear did more than protect the soldier. It reshaped him, physically and mentally, into a tool of the empire. Life in the Roman army was defined less by moments of combat than by the steady rhythm of camp life. For most soldiers, days passed not in battle lines but within the ordered spaces of forts, marching camps, and temporary encampments. These places were not improvised shelters. They were carefully structured environments designed to impose discipline, efficiency, and control over thousands of men at once. Whether permanent or temporary, a Roman camp followed a predictable layout. Order was enforced through geometry. Roads ran straight, spaces were measured, and every unit knew its assigned position. This consistency mattered. A soldier could arrive at a new camp in unfamiliar territory and still know exactly where to go, where to sleep, and where to report. Confusion was the enemy of discipline. Permanent forts were built to last. Timber, stone, and earthworks created secure enclosures that housed garrisons for years at a time. Inside, barracks were arranged in long, narrow buildings, divided into small shared rooms. Each room housed a group of soldiers who lived, slept, and stored their gear together. Privacy did not exist. Personal space was limited to what could be claimed on a bed or beneath it. Sleeping arrangements were simple. Beds were wooden platforms or straw-filled sacks laid directly on the floor. Cloaks doubled as blankets. Cold, heat, and damp were constant companions. Soldiers learned to sleep through noise, movement, and discomfort. Deep rest was rare, but adaptability was essential. On campaign, camps were constructed daily. At the end of each march, soldiers did not rest immediately. Instead, they built. Ditches were dug, ramparts raised, gates marked, and tents pitched according to strict rules. This work was done regardless of exhaustion, weather, or threat level. The routine itself was a form of security. A fortified camp reduced surprise attacks and reinforced discipline after long marches. Tents were shared, typically housing several men from the same unit. Space was tight. Gear was stacked carefully to avoid damage or theft. Fires were controlled and monitored. Smoke, smells, and constant proximity shaped daily experience. Bonds formed through shared discomfort rather than conversation. The day followed a regulated schedule. Soldiers rose early, often before sunrise. Duties were assigned quickly. Some men trained, others repaired equipment, cleaned living areas, or performed construction work. Guard duty rotated constantly. Every soldier took turns standing watch, day and night, regardless of rank. Inspections were frequent and unannounced. Officers examined weapons, armor, clothing, and personal appearance. Dirt, rust, or disorganization were interpreted as signs of poor discipline. Punishment for failed inspection could be immediate. The goal was not neatness for its own sake, but readiness. A careless soldier endangered everyone. Hygiene was enforced as a matter of survival. Latrines were placed at specific distances from living areas and water sources. Waste disposal followed strict rules to prevent disease. Soldiers washed when possible, though water access varied by location. Cleanliness reduced illness, and illness weakened units. Water discipline was strict. Drinking from unapproved sources was forbidden. Wells, streams, and rivers were guarded and regulated. Contaminated water could cripple an entire camp faster than an enemy attack. Soldiers learned to respect these rules quickly, often through harsh example. Food preparation shaped daily routines. Soldiers cooked their own meals, usually in small groups. Grain was ground, boiled, or baked into simple bread. Fires were tended carefully. Fuel was gathered daily. Meals were functional rather than enjoyable, eaten quickly and without ceremony. Free time existed, but it was limited and closely watched. Soldiers gambled with dice, told stories, repaired personal items, or wrote letters when materials were available. These moments provided brief relief from routine, but idleness was discouraged. A soldier who appeared inactive risked being assigned extra work. Discipline permeated every corner of camp life. Noise levels were regulated. Movement after dark was restricted. Signals marked changes in routine. Orders flowed downward through clear chains of command. Even small acts, like stepping out of line or speaking out of turn, could attract punishment. Despite strict control, camaraderie developed naturally. Men relied on each other for survival, protection, and support. Shared hardship created trust. Soldiers learned each other's habits, strengths, and weaknesses through constant proximity. These relationships were practical rather than sentimental. Fear was managed through routine. The predictability of camp life reduced anxiety in dangerous environments. Soldiers trusted that procedures would protect them, even when threats were unseen. Order provided psychological stability as much as physical security. Night brought its own challenges. Watches were assigned, alarms prepared, and silence enforced. Sleep was light and easily broken. Sudden sounds could trigger rapid response drills. Soldiers learned to move from rest to readiness in moments. Camp life reinforced the idea that a Roman soldier was never off duty. Even in moments of rest, he remained part of a system that demanded awareness and compliance. The camp was not a refuge from military life. It was its clearest expression. Through months and years of this routine, soldiers internalized discipline until it became instinctive. Order no longer felt imposed, it felt normal. In this way, the camp shaped the soldier as powerfully as any battlefield, teaching him how to live under constant authority without resistance. Survival in the Roman army depended as much on food and pay as it did on weapons and discipline. A soldier could endure pain, fatigue, and fear, but hunger and deprivation eroded morale quickly. For this reason, the army treated supply, rations, and wages as essential tools of control rather than simple benefits of service. A soldier's basic ration was built around grain. Wheat was issued regularly and formed the foundation of nearly every meal. It was not provided as finished bread. Soldiers received raw grain and were expected to process it themselves. This meant grinding, boiling, or baking whenever time and fuel allowed. The work was repetitive and time-consuming, but it reinforced self-sufficiency and routine. From grain came porridge, flatbread, or simple loaves baked over open fires. These foods were filling rather than pleasant. Flavor was secondary to calories. Salt was highly valued, both for taste and preservation. When available, Oil, vinegar, or herbs were added in small amounts, but most meals were plain and utilitarian. Meat was not a daily staple. It appeared irregularly, often tied to supply conditions, local availability, or special occasions. When meat was issued, it was shared within small groups and consumed quickly. Preservation was difficult, especially on campaign. Spoilage was a constant risk, and soldiers learned to be cautious about unfamiliar sources. Legumes and vegetables supplemented grain when possible. Beans, lentils, and peas provided protein and variety. Foraging was sometimes permitted, but tightly regulated. Unauthorized scavenging could lead to punishment, particularly if it risked conflict with local populations or exposed soldiers to ambush. Cooking was communal but informal. Small groups pooled their rations and prepared meals together. Fires were carefully controlled to avoid accidents and maintain order. Cooking gear was basic: pots, pans, and simple utensils carried by the soldiers themselves. There were no dedicated cooks for ordinary troops. Every man was responsible for feeding himself. Water was as critical as food. Supplies were monitored closely, and distribution followed strict rules. Dehydration weakened soldiers quickly, especially during long marches or hot weather. Commanders paid close attention to water sources, often shaping routes and camp locations around reliable access. Pay provided the other half of a soldier's economic reality. Wages were issued regularly, but they were not generous by modern standards. More importantly, soldiers rarely received their full pay. Deductions were automatic and unavoidable. Food, clothing, equipment replacement, and other necessities were subtracted before wages reached the soldier's hands. This system ensured dependence. A soldier was paid enough to survive, but rarely enough to accumulate wealth easily. Savings required discipline and patience. Many soldiers sent small portions of their pay home when possible, though this depended on location and access to reliable couriers. Bonuses and rewards offered occasional relief. Victories could bring extra payments, gifts, or distributions of goods. These moments boosted morale and reinforced loyalty. However, they were unpredictable and often tied to performance, favor, or circumstance rather than effort alone. Loot existed, but it was regulated. Contrary to popular imagination, soldiers could not simply take what they wanted. Plunder was typically controlled by commanders and distributed according to rank and rules. Unauthorized theft risked severe punishment. The army valued order over individual enrichment. Some soldiers sought additional income through small side activities. Craft skills, repairs, and trading were common within camps. Soldiers fixed gear, mended clothing, or produced simple goods for fellow troops. These activities were tolerated as long as they did not interfere with duties or discipline. Debt was a constant threat. Poor spending, gambling losses, or fines could quickly erase savings. Soldiers who fell into debt became vulnerable, dependent on comrades or officers for support. This dependence further reinforced hierarchy and control. Economic life in the army was tightly structured. Everything a soldier needed flowed through the system. Food, pay, and rewards were tools used to shape behavior. Compliance ensured stability. Disobedience risked deprivation. Hunger was not uncommon, especially during difficult campaigns. Rations could be reduced, delayed, or stretched thin. Soldiers learned to endure scarcity, trusting that the system would eventually provide. Complaints were discouraged. Endurance was expected. Over time, soldiers adapted to this controlled economy. Expectations lowered. Needs simplified. Luxury became irrelevant. Survival, routine, and modest security replaced ambition. By managing food and pay so carefully, the Roman army maintained cohesion across vast distances and long periods. Soldiers might grumble, but they stayed. The system worked not by generosity, but by predictability. In this way, rations and wages were not just sustenance. They were instruments of discipline, shaping daily life and reinforcing the soldier's dependence on the army for survival. Discipline was the invisible framework holding the Roman army together. Without it, numbers meant nothing, and training collapsed under pressure. The army understood this clearly. Obedience was not encouraged, it was enforced. Law, punishment, and constant oversight ensured that soldiers followed orders, even when fear, exhaustion, or self-preservation urged them to do otherwise. From the moment a man enlisted, he entered a legal world separate from civilian society. Military law governed every action, both on and off duty. A soldier could be punished for behavior that would be ignored or lightly fined in civilian life. Authority flowed downward in a rigid chain, and every level possessed the power to discipline those below. At the center of daily enforcement stood the centurion. These officers were not administrators or strategists. They were disciplinarians. Their role was to maintain order, readiness, and cohesion within the unit. A centurion's reputation mattered. Some ruled through fear, others through consistency, but all relied on the certainty that punishment would follow disobedience. Infractions ranged from minor to extreme. Small offenses included sloppy equipment, missed drills, talking out of turn, or failure to follow routine. These were corrected immediately, often through extra duties, reduced rations, or physical punishment. The goal was correction, not debate. More serious offenses carried heavier consequences. Theft, desertion, sleeping on watch, or striking a superior were treated as threats to the entire unit. Such acts endangered lives. Punishments escalated quickly and publicly, reinforcing the cost of failure. Flogging was common and deliberate. It inflicted pain without permanent injury, serving as a warning rather than a removal. Public punishment reinforced collective responsibility. Soldiers were forced to witness consequences, reminding them that no one was beyond discipline. In extreme cases, execution was used. Desertion during campaign, mutiny, or repeated disobedience could result in death. These sentences were rare but unforgettable. The army believed that a single harsh example could prevent countless future failures. Collective punishment amplified fear and accountability. Units could be penalized for the actions of individuals. Extra labor, reduced pay, or harsher conditions forced soldiers to police each other. This system reduced the burden on officers while strengthening internal discipline. Honor existed alongside fear. Soldiers were taught to value reputation within the unit. Cowardice, laziness, or unreliability stained a man's standing. Praise was limited, but respect among peers mattered deeply. A soldier who failed under pressure carried that reputation long after the moment passed. Rewards reinforced obedience. Decorations, promotions, and public recognition were tools used to balance punishment. Advancement depended not only on bravery, but on consistency and reliability. A soldier who followed orders precisely was valued more than one who acted independently. The psychological impact of this system was profound. Soldiers learned to anticipate consequences before acting. Obedience became instinctive. Orders were followed not because they were always understood, but because hesitation carried risk. Fear was not constant panic, it was controlled awareness. Soldiers lived knowing that their actions were observed, judged, and remembered. This awareness shaped behavior even in moments of apparent freedom. Over time, discipline ceased to feel external. Soldiers internalized rules until they governed themselves. The army no longer needed constant force to maintain order. Habit did the work. This internalization allowed the Roman army to function under extreme conditions. Exhausted, hungry, and frightened men continued to hold formation because obedience had replaced impulse. Discipline bridged the gap between training and survival. Law and punishment were not signs of cruelty alone. They were systems designed to preserve cohesion in environments where hesitation meant death. The Roman army accepted this trade openly. By enforcing discipline relentlessly, the army ensured that individual fear never outweighed collective survival. In this balance of control and obedience, Rome built forces capable of enduring pressures that would shatter less regulated armies. Marching was the true test of a Roman soldier. Battles were rare by comparison, but movement was constant. Campaigns were measured not in clashes of armies, but in distance covered, terrain crossed, and days endured under load. The army's ability to move reliably across vast landscapes determined success more than any single fight, because an army that could not arrive intact was already defeated. A march began before dawn, often in darkness. Soldiers rose at signal, packed gear quickly, and assembled without hesitation. There was no room for delay or confusion. Each man carried his assigned load, and inspections ensured that nothing essential was missing or improperly secured. Once the column moved, it did not wait for stragglers. A soldier who fell behind learned quickly that the army advanced without him. Formation on the road mattered as much as it did on the battlefield. Units marched in ordered columns, maintaining spacing and alignment even when visibility was poor. Scouts moved ahead, watching for ambushes, broken bridges, or hostile movement. When terrain allowed, flanks were guarded to prevent surprise attacks. The army advanced as a controlled body, not a scattered crowd, reinforcing discipline with every step. Roads varied widely in quality. Some routes were paved and carefully maintained, offering stability and speed. Others were little more than dirt paths cut through forests or hills. Mountain passes narrowed columns and increased vulnerability. Mud clogged footwear and slowed progress. Dust coated lungs and skin until breathing itself felt like work. Rain turned movement into a constant struggle for balance and footing. Load management was critical to survival. Soldiers learned how to distribute weight carefully to avoid injury. Straps were adjusted repeatedly throughout the day. An unbalanced load caused shoulder strain, back pain, blisters, and long-term damage. A man who failed to manage his equipment risked becoming a liability, unable to keep pace or perform when needed. Pace was relentless but controlled. Commanders avoided sudden bursts of speed that exhausted troops too quickly. Endurance mattered more than haste. Soldiers were expected to cover long distances without breaking formation or losing cohesion. Falling behind drew immediate attention and punishment, reinforcing the idea that personal limits were irrelevant to collective movement. River crossings were among the most dangerous moments of a march. Water disrupted formation and limited visibility. Crossing points were chosen carefully to reduce exposure. Soldiers trained to move through rivers while keeping weapons and supplies functional. Panic was punished harshly, as fear in water could spread faster than on land. At the end of the day's march, rest did not come immediately. Work began again. Camps were constructed according to strict rules. Ditches were dug, ramparts raised, gates marked, and tents pitched. Fatigue was irrelevant. Security depended on routine, and routine depended on discipline. Only after defenses were complete could soldiers eat and sleep. Logistics followed the column constantly. Wagons, pack animals, and supply parties moved with the army, protected but vulnerable. Disruption to supply lines threatened starvation and collapse. Soldiers understood that guarding food and equipment was as important as guarding their own lives. Local populations added tension to marches. Requisitioning food and supplies was often necessary but dangerous. Soldiers were expected to follow orders regarding interaction with civilians. Unauthorized violence, theft, or intimidation threatened discipline and strategic goals. Control over behavior mattered as much as control over movement. Weather shaped every decision. Heat drained strength and water supplies. Cold stiffened joints and slowed progress. Storms turned roads into hazards and reduced visibility. Soldiers learned to endure conditions without complaint, understanding that nature was an enemy no army could defeat directly. The psychological toll of marching was significant. Monotony wore down focus. Days blurred together into an unbroken sequence of movement, labor, and rest. Sudden alarms shattered routine, reminding soldiers that danger was always close, even when no enemy was visible. Despite exhaustion, readiness was constant. Soldiers were trained to respond instantly, even after hours of movement. Equipment stayed within reach at all times. Formations could be assembled quickly, turning a weary column into a fighting force within moments. Marching built trust in systems rather than individuals. Soldiers relied on procedures, signals, and discipline to keep them alive. Confidence came from repetition and predictability, not comfort or morale alone. Over time, movement became instinctive. The body adapted to distance and weight. Muscles hardened, posture shifted, and breathing steadied. The mind accepted monotony as normal, learning to conserve energy and attention for moments of real danger. Through endless marches, the Roman army extended its reach across provinces, frontiers, and hostile lands. Roads, routes, and routines carried soldiers across continents. Movement itself became a weapon, allowing Rome to project power far beyond its borders without fighting every step. The march defined the soldier's life more than any single battle. It was where endurance replaced excitement, where discipline proved its value day after day, and where the Roman army turned ordinary men into a force capable of sustained conquest. Battle was the moment everything in a Roman soldier's life narrowed to a single point. Training, discipline, marching, and routine all existed for this purpose. Yet actual combat occupied only a small fraction of a soldier's service. When it came, it arrived suddenly and without ceremony, transforming preparation into instinct and fear into motion. The hours before battle were often the most difficult. Soldiers waited in formation, equipment checked and rechecked, weapons gripped too tightly. Orders were passed down the line in short commands. Speeches, when given, were brief and practical. They reminded men of duty, cohesion, and the consequences of failure. Fear was expected, but panic was not tolerated. Formation defined survival. Roman soldiers fought as units, not individuals. Each man's position mattered. Shields overlapped. Spacing was controlled. The line advanced or held as a single body. A soldier who broke formation endangered not only himself, but everyone beside him. The opening moments of battle were chaotic. Noise overwhelmed thought. Shouting, horns, and the clash of metal erased subtlety. Dust and debris reduced visibility. Orders were often heard only partially, forcing soldiers to rely on training rather than clear instruction. Weapons were used methodically. Thrusts were favored over wide swings, conserving energy and maintaining control. Shields absorbed impact and protected the formation. Soldiers fought forward, not chasing individual opponents, but pressing the line steadily. Injuries were inevitable. Cuts, punctures, and blunt force trauma occurred within moments of contact. Pain was often delayed by adrenaline. Soldiers continued fighting until wounds forced collapse or removal. Those who fell were quickly replaced by men from behind, keeping the line intact. The wounded were a constant presence. Some crawled away, others were carried back when possible. Many lay where they fell, ignored until the battle's outcome was decided. There was no pause for mercy. Survival depended on maintaining formation. Fatigue set in quickly. Armor trapped heat. Muscles burned. Breathing grew heavy. Training allowed soldiers to continue despite exhaustion. Short movements, controlled strikes, and reliance on shields conserved strength. Fear never disappeared. It was managed through repetition and proximity. Soldiers focused on the shield in front of them, the man beside them, and the rhythm of movement. The wider battle faded into fragments of sound and motion. Commanders adjusted formations as conditions changed. Reserves moved forward. Lines tightened or extended. Signals were used when voices failed. Discipline allowed these changes to occur without collapse. Victory was rarely clean. Even successful engagements left soldiers shaken and injured. The enemy retreated or broke, but pursuit was controlled. Reckless chasing risked ambush. Order mattered even in triumph. After the fighting stopped, reality returned slowly. The noise faded. Adrenaline drained away, revealing pain, exhaustion, and shock. Soldiers took stock of themselves and their unit, counting those who remained standing. The battlefield was a grim place after combat. Bodies lay where they fell. Weapons were collected. The wounded were tended, as resources allowed. Burial or disposal followed strict rules, driven by practicality rather than sentiment. Loot was gathered under supervision. Discipline remained in force. Unauthorized actions were punished even after victory. The army did not relax control simply because the enemy was defeated. Battle left lasting marks. Some were physical, scars, stiffness, lingering injuries. Others were psychological. Memories of noise, violence, and helplessness stayed with soldiers long after campaigns ended. Despite this, battle was not viewed as extraordinary within the army. It was treated as another task, dangerous but expected. Soldiers returned to routine quickly, cleaning equipment, repairing gear, and preparing to move again. The Roman army survived battle not because its soldiers lacked fear, but because discipline prevented fear from breaking cohesion. Training turned chaos into controlled motion, allowing ordinary men to endure extraordinary violence. For the soldier, battle was never the whole story. It was a brief, intense episode within a much longer life of routine and endurance, yet it defined everything that came before it and everything that followed. A Roman soldier's duties extended far beyond fighting. Much of his service was spent building, maintaining, and enforcing the structures that allowed the empire to function. War was episodic. Labor was constant. Through engineering, construction, and policing, soldiers transformed conquered territory into controlled space. Engineering work began almost immediately upon arrival in a new area. Soldiers surveyed ground, measured distances, and marked lines. Roads were cut through forests and hills, leveled, drained, and paved where resources allowed. These roads moved armies, but they also moved trade, taxes, and administrators. A soldier understood that every mile built tightened Rome's grip. Bridges were critical targets and critical assets. Rivers divided territory and slowed movement. Soldiers constructed temporary crossings quickly using timber and rope, then replaced them with durable structures when time permitted. Guarding bridges became a routine duty, as their loss could isolate entire regions. Fortifications were everywhere. Permanent forts anchored borders and trade routes. Temporary forts appeared wherever armies halted. Walls, towers, ditches, and gates were built to standard patterns, allowing rapid construction by men who had done the same work dozens of times before. The repetition turned labor into efficiency. Siege work demanded patience and precision. Soldiers dug trenches, built ramps, erected towers, and constructed engines under constant threat. Days or weeks passed without direct combat as hunger and fear wore down defenders. Siege labor was exhausting and dangerous, often more so than open battle. Maintenance never stopped. Roads eroded. Walls cracked. Timber rotted. Soldiers repaired what they had built, often returning to the same sites year after year. This continuity created familiarity with terrain and infrastructure, binding units to specific regions. Beyond construction, soldiers enforced order. Patrols monitored roads and settlements. Escorts protected officials, messengers, and tax collectors. Presence alone deterred resistance. A small detachment, properly equipped and disciplined, could control large populations through visibility and routine. Interaction with civilians followed strict rules. Soldiers were expected to behave predictably, not kindly. Excessive violence threatened stability. Excessive leniency invited disorder. Commanders balanced force and restraint carefully, knowing that reputation traveled faster than troops. Markets and local trade became points of contact. Soldiers bought food, tools, and services when allowed. These exchanges spread Roman currency, language, and habits. Over time, military presence reshaped local economies. Marriage and family life were complicated. Official restrictions often limited formal marriage during service, but informal relationships developed near forts. Children grew up around garrisons, blurring lines between military and civilian life. Veterans often settled where they had served, extending Roman influence long after campaigns ended. Soldiers also acted as symbols. Armor, standards, and discipline projected authority. Ceremonies, parades, and inspections reinforced the idea of Roman permanence. Even in peaceful times, the army reminded populations who ruled. The soldier's role as builder and enforcer required adaptability. One day demanded manual labor, the next guard duty, the next escort service. This variety kept units occupied and reduced idleness, which commanders viewed as dangerous. Through these tasks, soldiers learned that conquest was only the beginning. Holding territory required constant effort. Roads, walls, and routines mattered as much as victories. By turning soldiers into builders and administrators, Rome ensured that its army was embedded everywhere it ruled. The empire was not held together solely by fear of battle, but by the daily presence of disciplined men, shaping land and life to Roman patterns. In this way, the Roman soldier became more than a fighter. He became an agent of transformation, carrying the empire forward with shovel, hammer, and watchful eye, as often as with sword and shield. A Roman soldier's career did not end with the last battle he fought. It ended slowly, shaped by years of service, survival, and adaptation. For those who lived long enough to complete their term, military life left marks that never fully faded. Promotion, discharge, and veteran status were not rewards in the modern sense, but transitions into a different kind of endurance. Advancement within the army was possible but limited. Most soldiers remained in the lower ranks for their entire service. Promotion depended less on bravery alone and more on reliability, literacy, and the favor of superiors. A man who followed orders precisely, maintained discipline, and avoided trouble stood a better chance than one who acted boldly but unpredictably. Those who advanced found that authority brought new burdens. Non-commissioned officers enforced discipline among former peers. They inspected equipment, supervised labor, and carried responsibility for mistakes made by others. Promotion separated men from old friendships and placed them under constant scrutiny from above and below. Pay increased with rank, but so did expectations. Higher status soldiers were expected to set an example at all times. Failure carried greater consequences. Authority was never secure. It had to be justified daily through performance and obedience. Decorations and honors existed, but they were selective. Public recognition reinforced loyalty and competition, yet it remained rare enough to retain meaning. Most service passed without ceremony, marked only by routine and repetition. Discharge, when it came, was both anticipated and feared. Years of service reshaped identity so thoroughly that civilian life felt unfamiliar. Soldiers who left the army lost structure, purpose, and constant oversight overnight. Freedom arrived without guidance. Veterans often received land or financial settlements, though these promises were not always fulfilled evenly. Settlements were frequently located near former posts, encouraging veterans to remain where their skills and habits fit best. These communities extended military influence into civilian life. Physical consequences followed soldiers home. Chronic pain, joint damage, and untreated injuries limited labor options. Aging arrived early for many veterans. The body that had been shaped for endurance often struggled outside rigid routine. Psychological scars were harder to name. Memories of violence, loss, and constant vigilance lingered. Veterans carried habits of alertness into quiet environments. Sleep remained light. Noise-triggered reflexes learned long ago. Despite these burdens, veteran status carried respect. Former soldiers were recognized as disciplined and reliable. Many found roles in local administration, security, or trade. Military service became a foundation for authority within communities. Not all veterans prospered. Some drifted, unable to adapt. Without the Army's structure, discipline became weight rather than strength. These men faded quietly from record, their service remembered only in scars and stories. For those who settled successfully, the Army never fully released its grip. Daily habits remained. Tools were maintained carefully. Time was measured precisely. Discipline persisted even without orders. The legacy of a Roman soldier extended beyond his lifetime. Roads he helped build endured. Forts became towns. Children grew up near former camps. The empire's shape reflected the labor of countless anonymous men. In the end, life as a Roman soldier was defined not by moments of glory but by sustained endurance. The army demanded everything and returned little comfort, yet it created a sense of belonging and purpose unmatched in civilian life. For those who served, Rome was not an abstract empire. It was the march beneath their feet, the weight on their shoulders, the routine that shaped their days, and the discipline that governed their lives long after service ended. If you found this journey through Roman history valuable, support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. Until next time, rest well.